that we see here. I think if you think of this, really, this for me is the enduring piece of the play that really helps me make sense of one of its major themes. Because if we think about this sitting down, it's meaningless in itself, isn't it? You know, if you imagine seeing a scenario like this in public where two people are just simply quibbling with each other whether one of them sits down or one of them stands up. But it is quite simply, you know, the most nakedly obvious physical manifestation of the hierarchical relationship between two individuals. You know, sitting down or standing up. If one of them's standing up, one of them's sitting down. You'll notice this. If you imagine how you feel if you're eating your lunch and someone just stands over the top of you as you're doing it, it doesn't feel particularly pleasant because even if it's an indirect and perhaps sort of accidental display of power. And that's where this quibbling over sitting down comes from. It's the insistence on some form of power. And I think this is where we get a moment in the play where at least there is what we would call communicative honesty. They aren't communicating with each other in order to shroud their real thoughts or in order to mask their opinions. But this dialogue that centers around whether Stanley or Goldberg or McCann are going to sit down or stand up is the moment in which the actual nature of human interaction and human relationships, in Pinter's view, I think is revealed most sort of authentically and nakedly. That actually this is really all there is. It is just an issue of whether one of you is going to stand up and the other one is going to sit down. Whether that's in your head or it's in reality. This is really all there is at the bottom of human relationships. And so your choice as an ethically motivated individual is to make sure that you are not in a position to be bullied into sitting down by someone else. And remember, we're thinking of this in a figurative sense of being subordinated to someone else's will. You know, I don't think necessarily Pinter 100% is not arguing for becoming some kind of domineering individual that forces others to sit down, so to speak. He is most definitely, I think, trying to create a warning about taking for granted the hierarchical nature of interaction. Don't take it for granted that people say what they mean, because very frequently there is a sort of power motive behind the way that they're interacting with you, and that you don't necessarily need to be the person that's forcing power on someone else, but you do need to be aware of the fact that other people are going to do it to you, and that in order to prevent that, you need to be conscious of your flaws and you need to be willing to act to protect yourself. And those are some of the things that Stanley has a problem with, that self-knowledge and the willingness to actually put some energy into his life, put some sort of vigor into his existence, because the passivity of his existence is partly what enables him to become subordinated to these guys and their demands. So Stanley here is not given a reason to sit down, and they insist on it at the bottom of page 45. Sit down, and he just simply says, well, why should I? And there's no reason given for this. It's just simply an abstract, I think, exertion of power. And that I think that's where we see this sort of naked exposure of the hierarchical relationships that are the way that Pinter sees communication between human beings. He's not given any reason to do so. And they don't even pretend that they need to. You know, they don't say, well, you know, we're going to pretend and make up a reason why you should sit down. Because that is another moment where language would be being dishonest, I think. And this is one of those moments where we see the honesty and the authenticity sort of slip through into the interaction with the characters. And then Goldberg, I think, acknowledges this, because he says, if you want to know the truth, Weber, you're beginning to get on my breasts. This is a slightly unusual version of an English colloquialism where people say, you're really getting on my tits now. People will say that all the time. My mum says it all the time, which is, I'm sure she'll be delighted if she ever finds herself watching my sad YouTube channel. She always says that. She used to say it to my dog all the time, you know, get out from under me, you're getting on my tits. It's actually quite a Cockney, it's quite a London sort of slang way of expressing yourself. And Goldberg, I think, the reason he says, get on my breasts, is a sort of strange sign, I think, that actually there's a sort of performative element to his Cockney identity that's perhaps inauthentic. You know, it's another moment of that linguistic inauthenticity. Stanley attempts to respond to this. Really? Well, and then Goldberg just says, sit down. So there's not even a sort of plausible attempt to make a play at being diplomatic with each other here. There's just the simple, honest assertion of power going on. And Stanley just says no. And I think here, this is a moment where this is really his only, in terms of power, his only virtue in protection of himself is that this is a type of freedom and a refusal to be submissive at this moment in time. But of course, this ends up being something that he loses, that sense of resolution about just refusing to be subordinate to someone else. Goldberg sighs and sits at the table. Right, the sigh is obviously this sense of, I'm going to succeed in the end, and that you're really just prolonging the process. He's prolonging the process, and of course he ends up being proved right. And I think that sigh brings about the idea of fatalism, that there is some sense of the fate of this character being determined already for him in a way that's beyond his control. And that, I think, is something that we see in all three of the plays that we've currently got on the go at the moment. The characters in Desire Under the Elms are driven by that sense of, I think, almost like planetary impulsive conflict between those sort of Apollonian and Dionysian urges that those characters experience. Blanche and all the characters in Streetcar are completely driven by desire itself, and that's where the play gets its sort of metaphorical title. But here, I think it's the inevitability of the orthodox power structures that are the fatalistic element of the determination of the character's fate. So this precipitates this really bizarre, indirect dialogue here between McCann and Goldberg and Stanley, where Goldberg addresses McCann and asks him to sit down. And then McCann says, "Yes, Nat. Do you mind sitting down?" "Yes, I do mind." "Yes, now, but it'd be better if you did. Why don't you sit down?" "No, not me. No, thanks." So this, I think, the annotation we've got here, this dialogue between the two of them, I think, gives us a sense of complacency between the two interrogators at this moment in time. And I think his resistance to this is based on a kind of rigidity to the actual meaning of the language that they use here. So his stubbornness and his rigidity is a resistance on the level of language more than anything, rather than a resistance that's based on any real sense of power ethics. His rigidity is exposing, for example, the inauthenticity in phrases like this one. "It'd be better if you did." And then he says, "Well, why don't you sit down?" "No, not me, you. No, thanks." There is at this moment in time, I think, a sense of the way that he at least understands the slipperiness of the language that those in positions of authority use. He understands that there's this sort of evasive, deceptive quality about the language that they use when they speak with each other. And then the pause at the end of this dialogue, Stanley says, "No thanks." And we think of that phrase as well as being one that's typically of politeness. "Oh, no thank you, I don't want this." And the pause at the end, I think, is communicating that sense of Stanley's awareness of the inauthenticity of their language. And that's one of his virtues as a character, and I think that's partly what's symbolized by the glasses, is his ability to see reality actually for what it is, beneath the false surfaces of orthodox power. He is capable of looking beyond their, I think, their almost ritualistic use of language. This language that he uses has that, it's almost comic, it really does evoke, I think, that vaudeville quality that you see in The Killers by Hemingway, where they seem almost kind of like pantomime clowns with each other. And it always is on the verge of descending into something sort of farcical humour, but at the bottom of it, it's menacing because it's empty. It's menacing because it's hollow, and that there's no real sense of responsiveness to the situation. They have a set of linguistic formulae that they're going to roll out, and if it doesn't work, they'll end up being aggressive. And that's exactly what we see. So, the sitting down carries on. Nat, what? He won't sit down. Well, ask him. I've asked him. Ask him again. Sit down. Why? You'd be more comfortable, so would you. So, again, there's this language of kind of benign, friendly kind of quality to this. And Stanley's response to this, I think, again, is this deliberate attempt to turn it back on them. He turns their language back on them by saying, "Well, so would you. So would you if you sat down as well. You'd be more comfortable." There's again this phrase here that is masking its hostility through its false politeness. There's a false sense of gentility about the way that they speak to each other. And that pause at the end, I think, gives us the awareness, Stanley's awareness of the violent intent behind their lies, behind their linguistic habits, the euphemistic and evasive language that they use to communicate with him. Again, the fact that they are having the dialogue about the fact that he won't sit down between themselves in front of him, I think, again, is another way of physically manifesting the inauthenticity of communication. That we've all been in that circumstance before when people do that. They have a conversation with someone else about you within earshot of you being there, and it's a really uncomfortable, unsettling experience when you hear someone doing that. Here, I think it's very deliberate, and it again shows, I think, their reluctance to directly engage with him through language on a one-to-one basis, because they don't see him as an authentic individual. They see him as someone that is simply there to be oppressed and to be subordinated. And so therefore there's no need really to directly engage with him as an authentic individual. I can just have my conversation with my associate, or some vague, waffly word like that. That might be how they would describe themselves. And McCann says, all right, if you will, I will, you first. And this is an important moment when eventually we have this moment of sitting down that occurs. McCann slowly sits at the table left, and then Stanley says, well, and then, he says, right, now you've both had a rest, you can get out. And then the shift in the language that occurs within that one single moment in the play, I think is where you get this explosion of the honest intent of their language. That's a dirty trick, I'll kick the shite out of him. We've got immediate switch from, oh, you'll be more comfortable, you should sit down, to I'm going to kick the shite out of you. We've got this extremely colloquial and aggressive language that immediately explodes when Stanley tricked one of them into sitting down. And that's simply all they're bothered about. That's what it exposes, the power hierarchy between the two of them through this physical set piece. The change in their language is what shows us that this is really how they mean to communicate with him. It empties this faux gentility from their language, takes away this sense of false politeness that's masking their central and honest intent with him. So Goldberg gets up. No, I've stood up. And McCann says, sit down again. Once I'm up, same here. So there's this bizarre shift here from this moment of significance and aggression into this bizarre sense of positivity. This is the phrase that your slightly chipper, positive Cockney geezer might say. I can't sleep once I'm up, I'm out. I'm going to polish my shoes. I'm going to go and seize the day. Carpe diem. He's one of these characters that's filled with all these kind of cliched conversational rituals that give him the sense of feigned enthusiasm, that give him the sense of sort of a positive individual that is grabbing life by the scruff of the neck and sort of taking it to them and becoming an orthodox part of the establishment. And that's where his language comes from. Once I'm up. And then Stanley knows this and says, well, same here. You've made Mr. Goldberg stand up, and he gets annoyed by this. So the banality of this versus the significance is really important. And there's violence behind our civilized kind of roles. And that's the important thing that we see here, is that we've got this very banal language that's being used, this cliche that's being used to render this action that's happening on the stage. But beneath that very conventional, cliched, meaningless language and dialogue is this very violent hierarchical relationship between the characters and an effort to impose their will upon someone else. Stanley gets reasonably clever with his language here, because McCann says, you've made Mr. Goldberg stand up, as if it's a real violation of his position. His position is something he keeps talking about. Oh, well, I've got a position. It's not a thing that I would deny. I've got a position. And Stanley says, it'll do him good. And this is precisely their language. So he starts to use their evasive, cliched language to describe this sort of toing and froing that they have over the issue of sitting down. McCann, though, you can see McCann's personality, or what is, if we can use the word personality in a play like this, his instinctive aggression would probably be a better way of describing what we're talking about here. But McCann's repetitions in this play very frequently, I think, are sources of authenticity, bizarrely. You know, that this one shows us the singular focus that McCann has on just enforcing his sense of power on someone else. Get in that seat. And Goldberg tries to calm him down. McCann, get down in that seat. He just repeats this language, and it very deliberately sounds like someone talking to a kind of dog that they're trying to train here. And Goldberg crosses to him. Weber, sit down. And then there's this silence. And Stanley begins to whistle the Mountains of Morn. And he strolls casually to the chair at the table. They watch him. He stops whistling, silence, and then he sits. So this is a really crucial moment in the play, because I think he begins to whistle the Mountains of Morn because he's trying, I think, partly to rob McCann's form of belonging as they force him into submission and orthodoxy. There's this sense of, if Stanley is whistling this song that is about a nostalgic vision of Irish national identity, the Mountains of Morn, it's about longing and wishing to be back in Ireland. If he's capable of whistling this song, it sort of takes it out of McCann's ownership. It's no longer your song, it's also mine. And I'm exposing your whistling of this song as some kind of sham, some sort of performance that you're carrying out in order to make yourself feel like more of an authentic Irishman. He strolls casually to the chair at the table. So there's a sense, I think, of him trying to give off the impression of being disinterested or not necessarily being concerned by this forceful behaviour that they're enacting on him. They watch him, and then he stops whistling, and then there's silence. I think this is Pinter's biggest type of pause, silence, where we have something profound going on that the character is incapable of articulating. And I think this is the moment of some form of acceptance of subordination from Stanley. He willfully sits down. I know that he is forced into it, he's coerced into it through their insistence. But ultimately, when we think about what actually causes him to agree to this, it is simply their persistence and the threat of menace that's beneath the surface of their language that forces him to. Then Stanley tries to flip this back on its head and says, well, you'd better be careful. And then Goldberg ignores him. Weber, what were you doing yesterday? Yesterday and the day before. What did you do the day before that? So we've got, again, this absurdist emptiness in Stanley's life being drawn attention to through the questions that Goldberg asks him. Because each day is the same. It doesn't matter whether he asks him, what did you do yesterday or what did you do a month ago? It's every single day. As I get up, I have my cornflakes made by the crazy woman, and then I have some average tea, and then I sit, maybe wander around, go to the beach, sit on a deck chair. He does nothing, basically. He does nothing really of any merit. And the fact that Goldberg keeps changing the terms of these questions, and the day before, what did you do the day before that? Those questions, he knows, I think, are supposed to bring up the purposeless nature of Stanley's existence, which is offensive to them. He is not committed to something bigger than himself. He's not engaged in society. He's not working for a business. He's not participating in a church sort of community. He's not doing anything that we would consider to be part of what it means to be an orthodox society figure. And then Goldberg immediately exposes this by saying, why are you wasting everybody's time, Weber? Why are you getting in everybody's way? So this final idea that he's getting in everybody's way, that there's no real physical basis for saying this. It's purely that they think, I think that he's getting in the people's way who live in this house. And one thing that the people who are doing that live in this house, but albeit in the most ineffective way possible, is attempting to contribute to society by running some kind of business. And so that is who he's in the way of. Stanley attempts to respond in the normal way. He attempts to respond to these accusations, but part of the issue with this dialogue and this beginning of the interrogation is that they don't really care about the answers to the questions, which is why they constantly shift irritably from one to the other. It is purely about the experience of getting him to feel inferior, and that they're not really interested in him actually answering the questions. They don't want him to have articulate responses to the questions. They want him to be kind of broken down and to lose his sense of himself and where he is. So he says, why are you getting in everybody's way? Stanley tries to respond, and he just says, I'm telling you, Weber, you're a washout. Why are you getting on everybody's wick? Why are you driving that old lady off her conch? Getting on everybody's wick means getting on someone's nerves, driving someone crazy. Why are you driving that old lady off her cont? Why are you driving her up off her head? And McCann says he likes to do it. Why do you behave so badly, Weber? Why do you force that old man out to play chess? Why do you treat that young lady like a leper? And I think there are some elements in this interrogation that give us at least a suggestion of some kind of authentic offence that Stanley has committed somewhere along the line. But again, it's important that we don't actually get given the nature of this. But there are, I think, Oedipal components to both of these accusations here, that there's a fear actually of adult sexuality in his relationship with Lulu. And then there's also this kicking of the old man out to play chess. There is an Oedipal impulse that drives his connection with Meg and that leads him to treat Petey as some form of rival. So there is an Oedipal element to the way that he interacts with Petey and Meg that is begging to be compared particularly to Desire Under the Elms, but also even Streetcar itself. There are elements of this in the way that the characters interact in all three of the plays, of Oedipal drives behind them. Here, there are also social codes that he has violated. But to Goldberg, they're not really something kind of that can be thrown away. These social codes that Stanley sees perhaps as some form of illusion, as some form of unimportant basis of social commitment. For Goldberg, they are the essence of existence. I mean, the phrase "the essence of existence" in Pinter would always be the opposite of what he's intending to expose, because what he's trying to expose, the essence of existence is its lack of essence, according to this type of play. But for Goldberg and McCann, there has to be something in their minds that they believe in, that they simply try and retain some form of integrity towards, and that those types of social codes are, I think, the closest thing that they have to this. She's not the leper Weber, and so here McCann's accusing him of, I think, a lack of belonging through the ideology of family, and that Stanley's the one that has no sense of connection to others, and therefore he is the leper. He is the disease upon the social body. He is the disease upon the body politic, so to speak. If you don't participate in communal or social endeavours, you are a kind of cancer on the concept of society itself. And this is where they begin to fire off in all these different directions. It says, "What did you wear last week, Weber? Where do you keep your suits? Why did you leave the organisation? What would your old mum say, Weber? Why did you betray us? You hurt me, Weber. You're playing a dirty game." So we have, within this opening section of the interrogation, we have this. There's a criticism for his clothing. There's a criticism for his lack of commitment to the organisation. There's an emphasis on the need for formality in his relationship. So there's trying to, I think, provoke guilt on his part, but they are provocations that are based on elements of orthodox behavior. That you should take pride in your appearance. You should feel some sort of commitment to something bigger than yourself. You should treat people with the formality that befits their status. What would your old mum say, Weber? Your behavior is now not making her proud, and you are letting them down the concept of the family. All of those are components of orthodox social existence, and all of their questions attack various components of what we would conceive of as orthodox social existence. And that it's important, not necessarily that Stanley actually has a response to this, but purely that they are able to bombard him with these questions that function much more like accusations. This is, again, part of the linguistic slipperiness in this play, is that they ask questions, but they don't care about the answers. The questions are there purely to make him feel a loss of self and a loss of integrity. And then they really get going here. That's a black and tan fact. Now, this comes back to, we looked at the black and tans when we were looking at Heaney. The black and tans are the police that were involved in the repression of the Irish people in the days of the conflict between the British Empire and the Irish uprising. So this McCann, again, is invoking this language that's supposed to give us his connection, I think, his authentic ethnic connection to Irish nationalism, but seems idiosyncratic in the nature of this dialogue itself. But I think what it tells you is the coherence between those two things, an authentic political concern, because it was about really power, and then a single instance of someone slipping outside of social orthodoxy, those concerns, if we're using this type of language, yoking together the most serious of kind of political concerns with the most ordinary, everyday, banal concerns of rebellion, then we see that they are indistinguishable, because they are both power acts. They're both acts of dominating someone or being dominated. Goldberg, who does he think he is? Who do you think you are? I mean, this I think at this moment in time is the focus of their interrogation, working out and unveiling to him that there is no authentic self beneath the surface, even though their whole ideology and discourse is designed to perform some sense of authentic identity that's based on commitments to society, that's based on nationality, that's based on ethnicity, that's based on religion. Any of these things that we continually invoke in order to give our sense of self, of coherent identity. At the bottom of this is really nothing. They're a series of performances in the mouths of Goldberg and McCann. Stanley, you're on the wrong horse. And so he starts to borrow these colloquial metaphors that we use, these sort of idioms. If you're on the wrong horse, you're backing the wrong horse. And I think what we see from him is this sense that they are backing the wrong path in life. But he's again trying to invoke their language, the language of social cliche, the language of idioms, and expose its meaninglessness. When did you come to this place? Last year. Where did you come from? Somewhere else. Why did you come here? My feet hurt. So we've got, again, the questions. They don't really care about the answers, because if they cared about the answers, they would stick to the questions until they got an answer out of him. The questions are designed to expose the pointlessness of his existence. Where did you come from? Somewhere else. It's abstract. Again, we don't know where his origins are from. We're distanced from that. And then, why did you come in? My feet hurt. And if we're taking this, his movement to the coast is obviously for a good reason. But here he refuses to provide one. And you could see this, I think, as an act of rebellion on his part, a deliberate use of banal language to mask his actual political or his sort of principled moral decision to move away from society. But at the same time, it could be an exposure of the meaninglessness of gestures of this nature. I'm gonna move down to the coast to be away from society. And well, actually, I only came here because my feet hurt. These are the typical. I partook in a number of these things when I was younger. I'm not going to wear stuff that's made in Madagascar because it's in a sweatshop and all that business. And then 2 seconds later you're listening to your iPod, which was made in a sweatshop. I think part of this thing is to expose, I think, a sense of vacuity and hypocrisy in everyday actions like this one that Stanley in his mind is styling as some kind of political event. They are very keen to expose the hollowness of this action. Why did you stay? Because I had a headache. Did you take anything for it? Yes. What? Fruit salts, Enos or Andrews. And did you stir properly? Did they fizz? And this is where we've got this bizarre, deliberate exposure that the questions are not important. It's the act of asking questions, because it immediately puts you in the position of dominance and authority that's important. Because the questions that are being asked here are questions in our conventional association, they're questions that someone would ask if they were concerned for the well-being of someone else, not if they were attempting to undermine the integrity of their identity. Here, what we've got is an exposure that the act of asking questions itself presupposes a position of supremacy, and that the actual nature of the questions and the semantics of the interaction are not particularly important. It doesn't matter actually what they're talking about. It simply matters that they are in the position to ask questions, and he is being increasingly inarticulate in his response. He says, now wait, you, and you can see his language in these couple of lines here, and then here. His language breaks down, and this is the sign of his loss of identity, the loss of his authentic self, and it becomes progressively worse as we move throughout the play, because actually Stanley is remarkably silent for a protagonist once we get to the height of the interrogation. And it begins here. His loss of articulacy begins when they start asking him these types of questions. Did they fizz? Did they fizz or didn't they fizz? He doesn't know. You don't know. When did you last have a bath? I have one every... Don't lie. You betrayed the organisation. I know him. So again, you've got this combination here of ridiculous, nonsensical questions that have no real connection to the supposedly political act that they have some form of resentment towards and anger about. And then an immediate reminder here that there is some sort of concrete point that they're trying to make about his betrayal of something bigger than himself. And it's almost like the organisation is not the important thing. It's actually the fact that he simply inconvenienced people that he has a responsibility towards that makes him unreliable. And I think there is a contrast, I think, between Goldberg and McCann here. Goldberg has a much more formal and ideological opposition to Stanley, whereas Goldberg himself is much more banal in this, and that we see that sense of articulate inauthenticity that's so associated with Goldberg being counterposed with Stanley's inarticulacy. And that's very frequently something that Pinter emphasizes, that the characters that we should sort of trust and that have meaning are the ones that struggle to communicate. The ones that are able to communicate are the ones that we should be most suspicious of, because they are the ones that are happy with the inauthenticity of the act of communicating and of language itself. McCann obviously has some greater sense of resentment than Goldberg, I think, though, and persists in his adherence to this idea that he betrayed the organisation. He says, I know him. And then Stanley says, you don't. What can you see without your glasses? Anything. Take off his glasses. And now this is, again, an important element of Pinter's stagecraft and actually something close to a symbolic prop in the play. His vision is of anything. And there's a normal way of seeing that makes society nothing. And so he can see anything he chooses to. And that's partly what they have... What was partly what they're unhappy about is that simply his existence means that their way of understanding themselves through this inauthentic rehearsal of cliche and this inauthentic adherence to organizations and ideologies, his existence in opposition to those is a sort of existential threat to their identity. You know, if you say to yourself that I am entirely committed to the organization because it is a source of belonging, anyone that has a conscientious objection to that particular way of committing yourself is necessarily denying your way of making sense of yourself and your sense of commitment to that. You know, just by saying that opposition to that mode of identifying yourself is plausible, they then represent not only a threat to your act of commitment, but to your identity itself. You know, if your sense of self is made up, for example, of a commitment to the church, you know, if you identify yourself as part of the essence of your individuality is as a Catholic, say, and then you have someone who's not only, you know, not a Catholic, but is consciously deciding to resist that method of identification. It's saying to you that it's exposing that your identification is basically an associative one rather than an essential one. It's not based on an essential nature. It's based on a performative connection that's usually at the level of discourse and language rather than anything more than that, anything greater than this. So he then represents that existential threat to them, that they represent orthodoxy in society, and purely because he has disengaged from it, it unmasks to them that their identities are nothing more than a sham. And so therefore, his vision of this, his ability to disengage from society is based on the fact that he can see the inauthenticity of it. And so what they decide then to do is to actually change how he sees. So rather than giving him a good reason for forcing him into a subordinate position, they just decide to engage, to tyrannize him through the act of traumatizing what he sees. You know, so we're not going to win the argument here. We're just going to change how you see reality. And the vision that the glasses symbolize, I think, is a symbol for this. It's a symbol for his alternative vision of reality as being absurd and hollow. And so McCann then snatches his glasses. And it's important that you get this very violent word being used here, because Pinter is the opposite of Tennessee Williams in his stage directions. You know, he's extremely pared back and will not use a verb like that for a kind of throwaway purpose. It will be carrying a lot of emphatic weight and emphatic meaning. So he snatches his glasses, and as Stanley rises, reaching for them, takes his chair downstage center below the table, Stanley stumbling as he follows. Stanley clutches the chair and stays bent over this. So immediately what you see is without his vision, he's powerless. So without his ability to see, obviously this has a naturalistic realism to it. You know, Stanley actually has bad eyesight, and without his glasses he can't see where he's going. But in a figurative sense as well, without his ability to see what is wrong with orthodoxy and to see what is beneath the surface of inauthenticity, he is lost, and he's much easier for them to dominate and subordinate when he cannot see reality for its vacuous, inauthentic nature. And the stage directions give us that. He's powerlessness without vision. And Goldberg here levels this at him. Whether you're a fake, they stand on each side of the chair. When did you last wash a cup? So we've got this, again, this ironic sense of his inauthenticity, Weber's fakeness, because he's been unmasked to a certain extent at this moment in time. You know, they have shown up, not necessarily his fakeness, but his inability to be a conscientious objector of some kind without his vision. But then the accusation that he levels at him has nothing really to do with inauthenticity. It's purely focused on his indolence, which is a reasonable accusation. Stanley is lazy and he doesn't contribute to other people. So what they then do is they manage to shift these banal acts of these banal character faults into some sort of meaningful justification for their violence. You know, that you're lazy, you're not looking after these girls, you're not looking after this woman. And they are very effective, Goldberg particularly, at performing that sense of commitment. He performs a kind of friendliness to Lulu. He performs a kind of friendliness to Meg. You know, oh, madam, you look like a tulip. And then he ends up sleeping with Lulu and ditching her. So what we see here is that those supposed principles that they criticize him for are, again, something that is simply a performance, and it is all about power rather than the principles themselves. He says, the Christmas before last is the last time he washed a cup, so he's lazy for sure. Where? Why do they need to know? Of course, there is no real good reason why they need to know. Possibly that they're trying to expose his lie. Lyons Corner House, which one? Marble Arch, where was your wife? In. Answer. What wife? So we have, again, this sudden ability of Stanley to be really precise about when he last washed a cup. You know, he can't. No one in this play can tell you why they're there, or what their motives are really for being there, or their relationship between each other. But he can tell you precisely the building that he was in when he last washed a cup, and that, I think, destabilizes us as the audience. We think, well, they clearly have the facility mentally to pinpoint actual moments in time, but at this, you know, it's purely for the wrong reasons. So even when we are actually able to remember the past in an authentic way, it's, again, to hide something. You know, he's hiding something through his authentic memory here rather than actually revealing anything important about himself. He changes his mind also about whether he's got a wife in the answers. Where was your wife? In, and then the answer turning, crouched, what wife? So there's, I think, a suggestion of his dynamic in this line that he uses constantly when he's telling the piano story, of formulating truth as he goes along. You know, he's formulating truth, and the version of truth that he presents is always provisional and liable to change according to the convenience at the moment. What have you done with your wife? He's killed his wife. So we go from, you know, where was she? She was in, and then he says, I don't have a wife, and then immediately the accusation is that he's a murderer. Why did you kill your wife? Sitting with his back to the audience, what wife? How did he kill her? How did you kill her? You throttled her with arsenic. There's your man. So we've got this, again, at this moment in time, there's a shift into a nightmare world from the banal. So there's I think, a kind of a paradigm for the play itself in these lines, a paradigm for the play's aesthetic in this exchange, where we could go from, when did you last wash a cup? At Lyons Corner House last Christmas, to you're a murderer, you've just killed your wife. That is the slippage, I think, from absurd sort of real naturalism to surreal, absurd nightmare that the play's aesthetic relies upon, being able to constantly, seamlessly shift between the two in order to disturb what we see as the everyday. It's not just for the sake of creating a complex sort of aesthetic. The reason for it is to say to us, how easy is it for someone linguistically to shift from a meaningless, banal exchange to an entirely menacing one that threatens the integrity of who you are as an individual in the space of 3 or 4 lines, and that the ease with which that disturbance happens is Pinter's effort, I think, to unsettle us, to show us that our everyday conversation can degenerate into violent brutality and sort of existential threat at the drop of a hat, the click of a set of fingers. Where's your old mum? So now he's murdered his wife, and now they're accusing him of doing something unsavory with his mother. She's in the sanatorium, yes. Why did you never get married? She was waiting at the porch. You skedaddled from the wedding. So we hear Stanley's gone from being a murderer to ditching his mother to kind of ditching his wife on the altar. And we don't hear any of the truth of this. We don't know whether this is real or not. And it's important that we don't know whether it's real and that Stanley's unable to defend himself against these accusations properly. Because there is a sense of, it may be real, it may be authentic, it may be plausible. But what we don't know is really the likelihood of this. And so the fact that before this moment occurs, the fact that we've got those ridiculous questions about, well, did you use andrew salts? Did you stir them? Did they fizz? And these very serious questions, I think, is a way of dampening the severity of these questions. These questions are, by their association with the meaningless ones, are also part of this meaningless performance, this sham of power interrogating the weak. That you can ask questions that sound plausible and serious, but you can also ask questions about whether they've stirred their medicine in the glass of water that they've poured themselves, or whether they washed a cup. It almost doesn't matter. And that's, I think, the point about the way that Pinter constantly modulates between moments of the highest severity to moments of utter banality, and that constant switching and modulation between the two, almost like kind of key in music, is giving us this sense, I think, of the indistinguishable nature of those different dimensions of seriousness. That, you can be asking if someone's a murderer, and then 2 seconds later you can be checking whether they've washed up a teacup. The questions themselves are unimportant. It's the dynamic of the interrogation that matters. And he is not allowed any opportunity to respond to any of these accusations. And this gets worse and worse as we switch over into these moments here. So he skedaddled from the wedding. He left his wife at the altar, according to these guys. You left her in the lurch. You left her in the pudding club. She was waiting at the church. Weber, why would you change your name? I forgot the other one. So there's this sense of them... Lots of the accusations that they level at Stanley are to do with his treatment of women. And what we do see in the play is his unpleasant treatment of women. And so even though we have no logical basis to believe in their accusations, Pinter deliberately gives us some form of sort of abstract reassurance that there may be some connection between his character and the actions that he's accused of. But again, we're utterly unable to form some form of opinion about whether it's right or wrong. Because I think, again, there's another exposure of our ethical thinking, that we are constantly in need of causes and effects to things that we really have no idea about, and that we're willing to formulate them often if we don't get provided them by reality, that we're very good at coming up with a rationale for behaving in the way that we do when there isn't one there in the first place. And so we see this, I think, partly through McCann and Goldberg here. They are formulating a possible rationale for their meaningless attack on him, their hollow, inauthentic attack on him. And then we switch. He's been horrible to his wife, and now he's changed his name. But then Stanley's responses like this one here, again, complicate the way that we can make sense of this as an audience. Why did you change your name? I forgot the other one. What's your name now? Joe Soap. You stink of sin, I can smell it. And there are so many layers of irony going on in this exchange here that he asked him why he changed his name, and Stanley says, well, I forgot the other one. So again, there's this sort of sense of the throwaway inauthenticity of identity, that you can just simply forget your name because it's meaningless, and that you could just borrow another one, like you can borrow an ideology, like you can borrow an ethnic identity like Goldberg, like you can try on any kind of discursive or ideological costume if you want, including your own name. what was your name now? Joe Soap. And obviously he knows one of the things he's been accused of here is being kind of smelly and disheveled and lazy. So he picks one now that deliberately goes against the accusations that have been levelled against him of being unclean and being, lacking pride in his appearance. So he chooses a name that's deliberately opposite to that. It's a sort of confrontation with their ideas. And then Goldberg says, "You stink of sin," and McCann says, "I can smell it." Of course, again, we don't smell these things. So just again, by evoking this language, by evoking this sense of disgust through this olfactory language that they use here, what they show us is the way in which we come up with linguistic strategies to convince ourselves of our own ethics and our own moral motivations. That "you stink of sin" couldn't be more meaningless unless we are actually talking about supposed sin of not attending to your own bodily hygiene. The fact that he smells of sin, I think, shows us that we are very good at inventing linguistic strategies to justify our moral behavior. Because in a logical and scientific way, you can't really smell someone's sin unless it's that they've chopped someone's hand off and it's got moldy or something. There's no tangible. Sin doesn't have a tangible universal smell, and so the fact that they use this language is showing us that we are capable of inventing almost figurative strategies, metaphors that help us to make sense of our own morality and show, again, Goldberg and McCann in the process of formulating a sort of ad hoc ideology that justifies their subordination of Stanley. They are making one up as they go along, purely on the basis of various snippets of various discourses that are associated with orthodoxy, of the family, of the pride in your appearance, of your commitment to a business or an organization. And we see this now, I think, much more directly as we go along. Do you recognize an external force? What do you recognize an external force? That's the question. Do you recognize an external force responsible for you, suffering for you? And this, I think, is where we get some of the suggestion of religion and its involvement in orthodoxy in this. His essential sin, according to Goldberg and McCann, is his refusal to commit to something beyond himself by becoming part of society. That's ultimately what society is. It's an effort to commit to something beyond yourself. We don't all wander around all day sort of rubbing butter all over ourselves and shoving cakes into our mouth and just kind of crapping wherever we fancy and just doing whatever we want. That's not a private fantasy of mine. I was deliberately hallucinogenic. That's not. If on my days off, that's not what I choose to do. But the commitment to behave in a certain way is also a commitment to something larger than yourself. When we say to each other, "Oh, we're not going to wander around naked," it's because, at least for one reason, is that other people might find it horrifying. Or wonderfully pleasurable, depending on the way you look, who knows. But that act in itself is a commitment to something greater than yourself. The idea of coming to school is a commitment to something greater than yourself. It's something that I always struggle to get students to understand, not you guys, but younger ones, that they aren't here just to pick up scores and to leave and to make money. There is something more than that, and that you need to be an effective cog in society in order to take your own place and to fulfill your own destiny. Here I sound like Goldberg and McCann, but that's natural. If you're in a teacher is a position of some form of orthodoxy and authority, so you are in a position to you can't help but start borrowing that language. You can't help but using that rhetoric of orthodoxy to make sense of someone. And this, I think, is where we see it in its most abstract form. This is the abstract idea of commitment to something beyond yourself that these two articulate here. Stanley just says it's late, and he refuses to answer this question. "Oh, it's a bit late for this. I don't really need to talk about whether there's an external force that's responsible for me or suffering for me. It's late. Late enough. When did you last pray? He's sweating. When did you last pray? He's sweating." Just this attack again on his commitment here to obviously some kind of spiritual sense of orthodoxy. I think the repetitions show their excitement. And I think the fact that we've segued through all these different topics throughout the debate, and they are most excited by this one, gives you a sense, I think, of Pinter's sort of anti-theological position. He's very clear about this. He calls them the flowers of our religion. Goldberg and McCann in a quote, and he calls them the bastards as well in the same statement. The phrase "the flowers of our religion" and "the bastards" are invoked by Pinter. He's very clear in his association of religious orthodoxy with political tyranny. He is deliberately yoking the two together. And it's not a coincidence that this is when McCann is most excited. He's sweating. He's gaining some sense of satisfaction out of seeing Stanley's first bodily manifestation of disturbance, because again, language is not trustworthy. So the fact that he's sweating at least registers some form of authentic emotional response. Now this part here is basically Pinter's version of a TOK lesson. Is the number 846 possible or necessary? Neither. Wrong. Is the number 846 possible or necessary? Both. Wrong. It's necessary but not possible. Both. Wrong. Why do you think the number 846 is necessarily possible? Must be. Wrong. It's only necessarily necessary. We admit possibility only after we grant necessity. It is possible because necessary, but by no means necessary through possibility. The possibility can only be assumed after the proof of necessity. This, I think, I've got a very small annotation for this part. The possibility of existence is determined by human need. I think is the subtext, the simplification of this dialogue. We've got this very deliberately scholarly sounding dialogue between two characters that is supposed to be an absurdist kind of send-off of abstruse sort of metaphysical exchange. That ironically this play is nothing more than a kind of a dramatic embodiment of abstruse metaphysical exchange. It's an extremely complex metaphysical play. Here, if we try and decode what the hell Goldberg is talking about here, we'll find ourselves in some sort of downward spiral, but it might be fun to do so. So he says the number 846 it's necessary but not possible. I mean, that particular idea itself shows us something about the nature of authenticity of existence itself. It's necessary, but it's implausible. The number itself we need, but is ultimately meaningless in its connection to concrete, tangible reality. We need it to make sense of our life. Why do you think the number 846 is necessarily possible? Well, it must be, and he here unthinkingly just kind of accepts it as part of norm. And Goldberg says it's wrong. It's only necessarily necessary. It's only necessary because we have some need for it. We admit possibility only after we grant necessity. So we only allow the number 846 to exist after we've decided that we need it in order to make sense of something. It is possible because necessary, but by no means necessary through possibility. So it's not that we need it because it exists. It's purely that it exists because we need it. That's the idea that he's trying to invoke here. And I think language falls into this category in the play. Identity itself falls into this category in the play. The act and possibility of communication falls into this category in the play.
Like, that's just continuing on the idea of the subjective nature of reality. Right? How we choose what reality is.
It is kind of, but I think if we used a phrase like the subjective nature of reality for this play, we'd be reading it inaccurately, because subjectivity itself is just as much of a sham as our understanding of reality. And that our self is really nothing more than a series of rehearsed discursive performances, that we are nothing more than the discourses that we use in order to enact our hierarchical power relations. And, there's a kind of creepy truth to this too. If you think of, I as a teacher, I'm constantly in a position where I have to rely on various types of discourses, bodies of language associated with moral conduct, associated with pedagogy, associated with literature, associated with perhaps even psychology. And I have to use all of those linguistic registers and discourses in order to do what I do. But ultimately, all I care about is you learning stuff and getting good grades at the end. And having a nice time, sort of, on the way. But, all of that stuff, it's all about your well. The language is there to mask the tangible reality. The language is there to shroud the sense of, well, actually, this is just a naked transaction of knowledge. I'm giving you stuff, I'm hoping that it works, and that you then do better later on down the line. And that's not actually how I feel, and it's not how I believe that what I'm doing works, but this is the way that a kind of Pinterian interpretation of education would be. Is that I'm performing all these different linguistic registers to mask the naked kind of tangible transaction of knowledge that's taking place, and that knowledge itself is possibly not even worth thinking of in terms of a transaction, because that implies some sort of tangible value that you can exchange with someone, and that, you know, if we are engaging in a transaction of knowledge that says the world is flat, then what was the value in the knowledge in the first place? And therefore, is it still a transaction? You know, you have all these type of questions being brought about here. But the key thing to take from this bizarre kind of metaphysical exchange is that we only grant the existence of something once we've deemed it necessary, that existence itself is brought about by human necessity, and that therefore it has no essential quality of itself. It has no what we call kind of noumenal value. It doesn't have something in and of itself that means that its existence is possible without our need for it. You know, things that exist are only because we need them to, and that therefore identity exists because we need it to. Language exists because we need it to. Religion exists because we need it to. You know, this is partly what this play is saying to us. But we only need it to hide the fact that we're just trying to dominate each other. And that's ultimately what the exchange takes place. The nightmarish quality of this exchange, though, ramps up in a serious way here. And actually, although there's tons of annotations in my book, it's not particularly complex what's going on here. He says, right, of course right, we're right and you're wrong, Weber, all along the line. So here, all along the line, they keep repeating, because it's another one of these cliched expressions that suggests, in this case, the sort of totality of their correctness. And there's been no exchange of ideas. There's been no debate whatsoever. It's purely that they have power, and that's what makes them right. They have more power than him because he sat down, and that's what makes them correct in this case. So the accuracy of correctness and inaccuracy is itself shown up to be just another symptom of who's powerful and who's not. We're right and you're wrong. Well, why? Because I'm more powerful than you, I say so. And that's ultimately what goes on here. Where is your lechery leading you? So now he's lecherous and a pervert. You'll pay for this with damnation. You stuff yourself with dry toast. You contaminate womankind. So there's this sense of bizarre type of gluttony. You stuff yourself with dry toast, but dry toast is always what we associate as being a very Spartan, sort of restrained thing to eat. You know, it's what you eat when people, old wives tell say, oh, you got diarrhea. You have nothing more than dry toast. You know, that's good for you somehow. But here, he's sort of accusing him of gluttony by invoking a very restrained form of eating. It's not, you stuff yourself with whole chickens and, pig on a spit. It's you stuff yourself with dry toast. It's actually a sort of contradiction in terms. And now he's filthy as well. You contaminate womankind. Why don't you pay the rent, mother defiler? So now he's not even contributing in a monetary fashion, so he's gluttonous, he's sinful and filthy in a diseased kind of way, he's making no monetary contributions, he's a mother defiler. So now this sort of taboo, I think, social norm violation that takes place, according to them. But again, this exists according to the fact that they need it to. It's possible only because it's necessary, to use their own language. These accusations that they're levelling at him aren't really authentic, but they are things that they know. There's a catalogue of things that they know they can accuse him of that exist because of our need to dominate each other.
Could this whole dialogue be like an imagined scenario in the mind of Stanley where it's just him confronting the reality of his inability to be a member of society? It's like an imagined dialogue with him in reality.
I think no. I'm going to be Goldberg here. Because I've got more degrees than you, I say no. But no, I think because this play would be considered what we call postmodern literature. This is and the aesthetic of postmodernism, I think, is to distrust some of that psychological dynamic that you see in modernism. That we have these texts that are based on the stream of consciousness, that there is some sort of integrity and value and authenticity in penetrating the psychology of characters. This type of literature typically empties that significance. And even though there is a kind of psychological connotation to his violence that he unleashes on Lulu and Meg at times throughout the scene. There's a very sort of deliberate emptying of that significance in the play itself. And I think for it to have that aesthetic, for it to have that sort of, well, we're going to penetrate the psychology of the character, it would need to believe more in the value of doing so. It would need to believe more as a play in the value of the psyche. But I think the play itself is making it very clear that even that itself is nothing more than a discursive sham. I dread to think what he would think of Freud. And I think we do get a very deliberate sort of parodic treatment of Freud in that interrogation scene. I don't think we should take it too seriously as an Oedipal moment. I think there's a relatively sardonic approach to psychoanalysis in the text itself. And so, like everything else, psychoanalysis is another one of these, academic discourses that is being used to really create a hierarchy. If you think of the archetypal physical scenario for a session of psychoanalysis, it's someone lying down and then someone sitting over the top of them. So there is, again, you imagine what Pinter would do with a psychoanalytic session. It would be, hey, lie down now. He'd be like, well, Jesus, that's even more subordinating than sitting down. Lying down is even more problematic. And we're, again, exposing that naked sense of hierarchy. I'm going to pay you $100 to tell me what's wrong with me whilst I lie down and subordinate myself like a little dog with my legs and feet up in the air. The body language is what he trusts and almost nothing else. The body language is where the truth is in this play, and the language is not. So he doesn't pay the rent, he's a mother defiler. It picks his nose. I demand justice. So we've got this constant switch between Goldberg and McCann that shows, I think, that because Goldberg's comments are ridiculous and farcical, and McCann's are seemingly based on some sort of ideological commitment. Justice, what about Ireland? You contaminate womankind. McCann is the scary, he's the scary terrorist. That's what he's being portrayed as, I think. The person who blindly commits to abstractions that they don't understand, and again, you'll start to hear echoes of Othello here, in order to justify their own power-based inaction on someone else. And that's what we see here. He's a very nakedly aggressive, domineering character, and that's really all we get from him in terms of authenticity. But what he borrows are justice, political causes, a care for women, all of these different things that he invokes. But what we see of him is really just a savage sort of brute. There's nothing more to him than that in the play. What's your trade? I play the piano. So that's the first time he actually responds to anything. And this is important, I think, in terms of possible connections with Blanche. I play the piano. That is the only thing that he can confidently say about himself in the play so far, is that he plays the piano and that he has glasses. The only thing that he's willing to identify is his aesthetic inclinations. And so Blanche, with her consistent efforts to evade reality and her consistent efforts to aestheticize reality through what she sees, I think invites a comparison with Stanley. And I think they share in that particular flaw. They are prevented from accurate self-knowledge through their inclination to aestheticize reality. How many fingers do you use? Again, it trivializes his concept of morality. And Stanley says, well, no hands. No society would touch you, not even a building society. So he uses this reversal here that, again, invokes Stanley's social alienation, but also in a term that robs society of its meaning. No society would touch you, not even a building. Well, a building society isn't really a society in the way that we think of it. It's a financial organization. It's like a bank. So again, he has this suggestion of Stanley's lack of sociality at the same time that he uses language that actually robs the word society of its meaning. So he accuses him of something and then takes away the significance of that thing. Like a co-op bank, a kind of communally owned bank.
So
He's trying to be kind of facetious, I think, with that description of him.
he seems like kind of anti-establishment.